So let's begin our evening with a prayer, shall we? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, we know that you draw us always towards the full maturity of our Christian faith. We know that you desire your Spirit to enliven our understanding of our sacraments and our entire way of sacramental living. We know also that your Spirit enlivens us to live into your call to be a people of justice, mercy, and compassion. And so this evening we ask that you continue to enliven our spirits, continue to breathe into us the enthusiasm and the wonder of your Holy Spirit. We ask that you continue to nourish us with your holy word. We offer you this prayer knowing that you hear it through the voice of the one who is your beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. So welcome back. Well, mostly welcome back to me because I've been away since last week. I caught a red eye after last week's session, and I've been in Chicago doing grandma. What can I say? Having great fun doing grandma for a week, and then going to spending the weekend in Louisville for a board meeting for Just Faith Ministries, which I'm the co-chair of their board. So, good to be back, good to be here. And this evening, we really bring the rubber to the road, we hope. We really, there's a lot of interaction at your tables this week, I hope. By way of plunging us right in, let's see how we do with this. Look at that, perfect. We step back, and our first two slides, three slides tonight, allow us to ponder just a few aspects of what we've been covering over the course of the last few weeks and kind of bring it up into the first century and make sure that we understand why it is that we're going to be talking about sacramental living filled with the Spirit of Jesus. So is this helpful ways? Yes. Some aspects that I'd like to point out. These were things that I've not mentioned before, but they're relevant for when you read the New Testament. We have a tendency to read certain things and interpret them in our heads. And I wanted to point out some aspects of reading through the New Testament that's important. And first of all, we often understand the language of when we step into the New Testament and we begin to read the Gospels, or we read the Pauline texts, or the other epistles, or even the book of Revelation or the book of Acts. We find ourselves so readily stepping into a language that we think refers to miracles and that which is miraculous and that which is supernatural. And here's the handiest way to think about those two terms, is that they didn't exist in the ancient world. They did not have the language. When we think miracle or miraculous, we have a tendency to think that which lies beyond the realm, for example, of the natural, that which lies beyond the realm of the medically possible, don't we? We think in terms of those ideas, that which is completely non-typical to how our natural world works. That's what we tend to associate with the term miracle. And so I find it not helpful. When you read the New Testament, it's much better every time you see a translation that says miracle, it's better for you to translate that in your head as mighty deeds. Because the world was filled with mighty deeds in the first century, people who could do mighty deeds. In fact, there were people who did mighty deeds that became the subject of a lot of discussion, and sometimes a little bit of drew animosity, because if you were a holy man, and there were many, who performed mighty deeds, and there were many. Oftentimes, you were seen as a magos, basically somebody who had the ability to use what we would today call magic as part of your repertoire as being a holy man. Something that is helpful for you to know is at every stage, and we could do a whole class on this, at every stage, the New Testament writers lean into making it very, very clear that Jesus was a holy man, was no kind of a magos. We are not talking magic here. It's actually fascinating to me. Sometimes I find if I chat with people and I ask them about their experience of Jesus and their spirituality around Jesus in their lives, oftentimes what I hear them describe back to me, I think the evangelists would be rolling in their grave, because that sounds more like magic than anything else. You know, sometimes people have attribute to Jesus so many miracles of this supernatural kind that the Israelites of the first century would not have realized that. So it's much more helpful for you to think of Jesus in terms of somebody who had tremendous powers as an agent of God to do mighty acts. And those mighty acts were acts that conformed with the desire of God to intervene so that the life of the community was never threatened, which I hope you've been hearing from me all the way through our trajectory through the Old Testament. Does that make sense? So Jesus did not suddenly become somebody, at least the evangelists don't want to portray Jesus as somebody who suddenly is a new force among the people in the who who can do miracles. That's our later development of our understanding of Jesus. The evangelists thought of Jesus as this extraordinary force commissioned by God. That's very much the Markan text, commissioned by God to be the one to ensure that God's great acts could visit themselves upon the community and bring continued life to the community. So that's a hugely helpful way. Every time you find yourself reading a word that's translated as miracle, try to translate it as mighty acts. Secondly, we have, and there are a lot of theologians whose work is encompassed in these short sentences that I have up here. You should be terribly grateful for me that I'm not exposing you to the theologians, because Bernard Lonergan is one of them. And if you know Bernard Lonergan, any of them, he's tortuous in. You should have seen how long it takes me to read my Bernard Lonergan notes just to be able to get to one sentence, let me just tell you. But the next point that I want to make is that it's anachronistic and inaccurate to think of illness as disease as biological and illness as psychosocial. Okay? The idea that, because, we have to contemplate what kind of healing did Jesus do? And sometimes you'll hear people say, well, he cured people, And then you have a lot of biblical scholars who will try to make sense. They will try to make distinctions between the curing that Jesus does and the healing that Jesus does. And did he cure in the biomedical way that we understand today, or did he heal in the larger sense that we often have? Well, when he took somebody and he healed them of their demons, for example, he reintegrated them into the society, into the world that they weren't able to be a part of. Well, isn't that more healing than curing? And you have all sorts of discussions around this. It's actually better to think of illness as a term that includes both dimensions, psychosocial and biological. Here's why. illness, as you have it up here, illness and spirit possession are, in the ancient world, in the first century, they result from the invasion. If you're a first century person, this is how you think. Evil and spirit possession result from the invasion of evil powers and domination that are connected with the very earthly dimensions of life. In other words, with socio-political, economic injustices. So when the world is off its kilter, the world is filled with disease that is both about alienation of people from society and biomedical issues. Oh, okay, so in the ancient world, the world was filled with evil spirits that were, if you like, a kind of a manifestation of the evil in the world. Funnily enough, in the tragedies of this week, we have been saying that there seems to be a connection in some way between powers that do not act ethically and speak ethically and carefully and as our leaders, and the manifestations of evil that emerge in society and manifest themselves in shootings and so on. I mean, there seems to be something that is larger than simply the personal. And I mentioned last week, and I want you just to hold on to that, those of you, to you, the association between chronic injustices with relation to food and nourishment and well-being and the exploitation of the land by those who diverted the food that could be sustenance for the people, who diverted that into profit, and therefore who created situations that led directly to the illness of the people, chronic illness. A friend of mine did her entire dissertation on the interaction between food and illness in the first century as it manifested itself in the Gospels. Absolutely compelling. So very, very, very important to remember. The next aspect that I want to mention before we get into full-scale conversion talk is some aspects. I'm going to turn this way here because I made my notes rather small. Some aspects of what Jesus confronted in the first century. He lived in the midst of oppressive imperial policies that were exploited by the empire state and the client rulers. Here's the thing, we don't see that as clearly as we should in the Gospels, because, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, you will often hear references to the scribes and the Pharisees. Is that not so? Well, if you only read Matthew's Gospel, you would think there is no such thing as an unhypocritical scribe or an unhypocritical Pharisee that existed historically in the first century. You would be convinced that you were hearing, that you were receiving a historical account of people who were completely bereft of any kind of moral compass and whose religiosity was extremely hypocritical. You know, if you think about it, you see Matthew portraying Jesus as saying, the scribes and the Pharisees, when they pray, they pull down their prayer shawls extra long so that everybody can see how holy they are, why they're just pure hypocrites. And that word hypocrite is a real word in the first century. It's a word for the mask that was used by those who were involved in the Greek drama displays in the first century in the theaters. So a mask is that, of course, with which you can hide behind. And so in the first century, scribes and Pharisees and especially in the way Matthew uses them, are words that really more properly represent those who were, to use the word, collaborators. You know how during the Second World War we talked about people who were collaborators with the Nazis? Those who Matthew saw as being collaborators with the Roman Empire. Those whose duties allowed them to be scribes and therefore in touch with writing out the rules and the regulations that governed their lives, the scribes, and they were the educated ones who permeated the rules that governed the Roman Empire. And so you have the scribes and Pharisees and Pharisees usually, in the way that Matthew uses them particularly, but also the other evangelists, refers to the leaders of the religious community. And I can't emphasize this enough. In the first century, there was no division that existed between the religious world, the economic world, and the socio-political world. There's no difference. If you were, I did so much research on this. I probably spent a year doing research on this just to make sure that I was right on this. Now my concentration was particularly around Asia Minor, but it was not any different for that which existed in what we would today call Palestine, in Israel. If you'd like some good information on that, there's a man called Richard Horsley, Horsley, who writes some very good books. He has just produced a new one. I have not yet assessed it for its readability by what I call real people, as opposed to, more academics. But he usually writes well, and his research is impeccable. I don't always agree with his conclusions, but his research is fascinating. And the extent to which people were downtrodden and knew it, and were exploited and knew it, and were distressed and manipulated and knew it by the Roman Empire. And so when we talk about the ancient world, the religious leader was the political leader, was the rich man or woman. There were women leaders, and they were rich. Women leaders and were worship leaders. So the leaders in society tended, for example, if you were a political leader in a city, you had to contribute to the well-being of the city. You had to underwrite the building of major stones and inscriptions and major buildings and the roads and the aqueducts and all of that. It was your responsibility to underwrite them. So you were wealthy and you were a civic leader, and on top of that you were regarded as being the religious leader for the purpose of kind of representing the cult of the Roman Empire. Do you see what I mean? There was no separation. Today we talk about separation, we talk about politics as if they're separate from religion. No such thing. There isn't a scholar on the face of the planet anymore that'll tell you that that there was separation between a political leader and a religious leader. All of that world was all intermeshed, and it's really, really important to understand how Jesus was perceived as a political leader and a religious leader, but ironically with no real position of power to sustain him, other than, and this is what Paul is so great about in his letters, other than the folly of the crucifixion. I mean, the folly of the cross, if you think about it. We believe in the foolishness of the cross. The great power of Jesus was the conquering of death. My favorite of all possible lines is when Peter says in Acts of the Apostles, basically something akin to, "You Romans, you who consider yourselves the leaders of the universe, you put this man to death, yet couldn't even keep him dead. Now we're going to talk to you about who's really the leader." It's just this marvelous, eloquent nailing down the significance of Jesus that we see. So really important to understand the enmeshed nature of religious and economics and the political context of Jesus. They experienced distress and anxiety in the village communities, and therefore Jesus' mission focused on the alleviation of people's burdens, always either trying to return or reinvigorate the time-honored Mosaic covenant principle. That's why I spent so much time on helping you understand the covenant and Moses, because far from just the simplistic 10 commandments, the Mosaic covenant had to do with all of the ways in which we observe the community's care for the weakest among us. I hope I made that very clear as we looked at covenant, and then we looked at the prophets and the objections of the prophets to the leaders, and how seriously the prophets took the failings of the leaders to take care of what we call the Anawim, the widow, the orphan, and the alien, which, as we will remember, is just code for those who are the voiceless, the discarded, the disposable, the outcast. It gives us pause, does it not, to have to ask ourselves, oh sugar, the entire context for my faith is the care that I'm supposed to be bringing for the dispossessed, the disregarded, the least among us, the most despised, the most, the most put aside, the most disposable, and that the context of our living of our faith it's relevant. I got to tell you, I was probably at least 30 to 35 years old before I had the remotest little hint, before I had the tiniest hint that such a thing had anything to do with my being Catholic. In fact, I was quite outraged. I might have said something like, well, why didn't somebody tell me that when I was baptized? I didn't agree to be volunteered to contribute to the community of caring about people who can't make it, people who fall between the cracks. At the time, I was quite incensed, because nobody had told me that growing up. They just told me I was to be sure to love Jesus, and they told me that I was to be sure to know that Jesus loved me, and variations on that message. But they never added in the responsibility, ethical responsibility that I had to live into what had become clear in the covenantal stipulations of the Old Testament, and which Jesus then embodied and lived out in the New Testament. So I put up here as reminders to us roughly what corresponds with some of the topics that we've taken up over the last few weeks. What we show in the covenant: faithfulness to Israel's God, lending without interest. I didn't mention that specifically. It was a very, very important thing in the ancient Israelites, that when you lend any kind of money or anything, that you lend without interest. That there's a cancellation of debts every 7 years for those who are burdened or made into slaves because of debt. There's a respect for the family structure, and there's the cooperation that is needed in order to ensure the survival and the maintenance of Israel. We call this Jubilee justice, and it's the most common theme. It's one of the very common themes that comes out of the covenant of Israel. And we always see, by virtue of what I spoke to you about in terms of Isaiah and the reading of the scroll of Isaiah that Jesus did, as we see in Luke's gospel, that connect. Do you know what I'm talking about, this reading of the scroll of Isaiah, where he says literally that the Spirit has come upon him, and that this is the time now, and it is the moment that the justice living that insists on the protection of the most vulnerable, it's time now. And so there's a new emphasis in the New Testament that God is now imparting a direct special power upon Jesus in invigorating and encouraging God's people. And there's this new spirit Of course, John is very good on the Spirit, on the Spirit as the Paraclete, the one who is always present to accompany us beyond the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we have, of course, the real strong emphasis on the renewal, a prophetic renewal that is, Jesus is really described in tones that echo the prophet Jeremiah. I will put my instruction or my law among them, within them, and I will write it on their hearts. This beautiful idea that now we have engraved in our heart the covenantal, the Torah, if you like, but the Jubilee justice that we carry that marks our way.
What is exactly the Jubilee justice? Is it all 5 of those?
Yeah, the Jubilee justice, if you go back to that very first reading that I had from Isaiah 58, Isaiah chapter 58, verse 1 and on, you'll see a very fine delivery of the concept of justice there. It's also in a number of other places. At the break, I'll see if I can find some specific texts that I can recommend. Jubilee justice had to do with the justice that was that righted relationships every 7 years, but also every 50 years. After 49 years, every 50 years, you had literally, if you had been enslaved, or any person in your family had been enslaved or had lost their land, that land was supposed to be completely returned to the one who had lost it, for no matter what reason, even if the debts had not been paid. A complete cancelling of all debts for those who were impoverished and diminished by virtue of having to be emburdened to repay these debts. Very significant. I have to, in fairness, say, no scholars have evidence of how much the ancient Israelites actually lived into that. What we do have evidence for is that they held by it over and over and over again, that they were they kept speaking to it. So they were either speaking to it so that people could really live into it, or to remind people to continue to live into it. But some of the historical evidence that lies behind the texts themselves can be hard to get at. So the verdict is out on how well the ancient Israelites as a community lived into the Jubilee justice that they aspired to. And so that said, are we kind of okay on that? We have a bit of a picture of what we think Jesus cared about, because it matters. Because our point in these times together our point is to take what we think we have developed in understanding of the culture that Jesus inherited and then that he lived into, and then this concept that we have about being a sacramental people, being a people who understand Christ as the sacrament of God. We've said it many times, Christ who points to and embodies God, and then the church who points to and embodies Christ. The church, sacrament of Christ, Christ, the sacrament of God. We've done that little arrow thing each week because what we are going to do now is we're going to delve into, in its simplest form, the question would be, so I've got to live Jesus? And the answer is, yep, I got to live Jesus. Now, there was a bracelet, remember, what would Jesus do? And that was really cool. I just found that a whole lot of people didn't actually know what Jesus would do, because their foundation around the Gospels and around the Pauline perception of Jesus, which I haven't even tried to get into, that would be a whole other class, what Paul understood about Jesus. I did a few sessions on that on the radio, but that's about a few years ago on Immaculate Heart Radio. If we're living out of the what would Jesus do, and moving it beyond its simplicity, because I find that rather oversimplified. The easiest way to do so is to move into, well, what is it that we do when we live sacramentally? And so, well, here we go again. Let's see, I think we got it down. Hit that there, and it's back, right? Did I run this by you already? I didn't. Oh, so there you go. Pharisees, I mentioned it. It's consistent with the intro I gave you, so I'll just give it to you. Let you read that for a moment. Right? Pretty consistent with what we've said. So, okay. So let's talk about conversion. Because what we're going to do is we're going to overlay the way of understanding conversion with living sacramentally, living the sacraments, if you like. But to live the sacraments, we have to understand what it is that we think we mean by this conversion. So what is conversion? Typically, I dealt with this in a brief intro last week. The best definition that I've come across is the one that you have here: the ability of individuals to adapt to changing circumstances, to grow and to develop new habits and skills, and to undergo dramatic personality shifts in response to deeply felt emotional and intuitive experiences. I'd like you to, for a moment, to pick out and maybe jot down a note if there's a word in that definition that really jumps out at you, or a definition, a word or a phrase. The ability of individuals to adapt to changing circumstances, to grow and to develop new habits and skills, and to undergo dramatic personality shifts in response to deeply felt emotional and intuitive experiences. Think back to your own moments of conversion, perhaps a moment of religious conversion, a moment where you stopped and you said, oh my goodness, you had what I like to call an aha moment. I remember when I went, Maureen, you were there, when I went to work at Catholic Charities in the Office of Peace and Justice. I found myself saying, oh my goodness, where have I been my entire professional life? How did I not see what people who work at Catholic Charities see right under their noses every day? How was it that I did not see the call of the gospel to those who are most vulnerable, who are showing up at the doors of Catholic Charities saying, can I see an immigration lawyer? Do you have a food pantry? Do you have anything that can help me not to be evicted? Do you have anything that can help me get out of a life of prostitution? Do you have any way of housing us as refugees? We're welcome in this country, but we need a way to be housed. And I had an aha moment that said, wow, I need to move from head trip to heart. So your behaviors change as a result of that. A conversion creates a decision that creates a new, if you like, or fresh frame of reference. And one way of entering into the process that lies ahead of us now, because I'm going to introduce you to a process of reflection in just a few moments, is to ask, to have inside of our head, so I now measure the motives and consequences of my personal decisions against the ideals I hold as emotionally, intellectually, morally, and religiously binding. So I have in my head a bright idea about my religious identity and the actions that go with that, and the thoughts that go with that, the behaviors, the assumptions. And those are the ideals that I have emotionally, intellectually, morally, religiously. And then I have my motives on a daily basis, and my emotions and the consequences of my daily life, and how do they come together? And we have a structure because of the sacraments that allows us to ask ourselves questions around these. So, according to Bernard Lonergan and Donald Gelpi, conversion marks the movement from irresponsibility to responsibility in some dimension of human activity. That's the general broad understanding of conversion. The moment in which we move from irresponsibility to responsibility with respect to some aspect of our human activity. So one converts, if you like, when one consciously decides to take control of some dimension of our behavior and our actions. So, as Lonergan puts it, conversion comes in a variety of forms, and he pointed out, need not only occur in religious contexts. It can occur intellectual conversion and moral conversion, as many of us know from people who are friends of ours who are not religious, but they have intellectual conversion and they have moral conversion, but they have no explicit religious context for that, right? I have many, many friends in Ireland, which is now really quite a secular country, and my family members who will spend great lengths of time explaining to me that how their moral life and their engagement with life in general and the way in which they think about life has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with their own personal growth as people, because right now they're pretty ticked off at the church and they just don't want to express those behaviors and thoughts as having a religious context. A reminder from last week of what Bernard Lonergan and subsequently Donald Gelpi, how they divided out, how they expressed the different kinds of conversions. See, I used to think conversion only had to do with religious conversion. I love Jesus. Got it. Religious conversion. I'm a Jesus person, right? And I thought that was when people speak about conversion, and this is my beef sometimes when we speak in a church about having a moment of conversion or metanoia, turning around, some kind of transformative thing, we tend to refer to it only in terms of our religious conversion. However, Lonergan said, no, there's much more to that. There's the affective, the intellectual, the moral personal, and the moral socio-political. And each type of conversion can condition and shape the rest of one's experience, either positively or negatively, by their absence. In other words, if I have religious conversion and moral conversion personal, but I don't have affective conversion, I don't have intellectual conversion, and I don't have moral conversion socio-political, I can be tremendously righteous. I can be tremendously fervent in my going to church. And some aspects of my life can change for the better. My spiritual life, my prayer life can be wonderful because of my religious conversion. And because of my moral conversion, I can become an extremely shall we say, straight up person of good behavior, right, in terms of my business dealings and my finances or my decisions that I make around whether to play around on my spouse or not, things like that we typically associate with morality, right? But I can sail through life without caring a whit for violence that occurs in our cities, for misfortunes, natural disasters that happen the other side of the world. And I won't think a single bit as to whether that has anything at all to do with my faith. And what these theologians are telling us, oh yeah, it's got a lot to do with our faith. So how do we learn to look at these and raise some questions that can make us as uncomfortable as I told you I had a desire to make you a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah.
The thing about
Big voice, please.
the thing about moral conversion, morality can have a fork in the road.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, like one person's morality might not be the other person's morality, and I'm thinking specifically politically.
So the statement is morality can create a fork in the road, because one person's morality might not be the same morality as somebody else, and she's thinking particularly about political aspects. That's why we spent the time that we did on understanding the ancient Israelites. We don't get to say that the entire covenant, the first covenant, to use that kind of language, the covenant that the ancient Israelites saw that they had made with Moses. We don't get to say, I don't care about the common good. I don't care about the widow, the orphan, the alien, the least among us. We don't get to say that because it has never, ever been part of the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, ever. So there are some not negotiables. For the guidance on that, we also have an entire stream of Catholic social teaching that has developed only in the last 100 or so years, that it is the sadness of my life, the bane of my life, that it's an optional elective course in our seminaries. And it's an entire course, it's an entire way of taking on the moral, because what you're referring to is the moral questions that are socio-political, as opposed to the moral questions that are personal. So we'll continue to look at these and see if the questions that we're asking are good questions. So each type of conversion can condition and shape the rest of one's experience either positively or negatively by their absence. I mentioned last week the phenomenon of the person who's an avid churchgoer, but who rather jarringly tells dreadfully bigoted jokes, perhaps does some defrauding, consistent defrauding on maybe their taxes or on their financial obligations, perhaps speaks dreadfully about other family members, and yet considers themselves to be a very good religious person because they go to church on Sunday, and that's incompatible with the kind of full conversion that we're called to. And that is my shameless argument here, that we are called to a conversion in the fullest sense, in all dimensions, with respect to each of the sacraments. So I've prepared for us today baptism, matrimony, Eucharist. I took that order for no real reason, because I know we won't be able to get through all of the rest. But what we'll do is we're going to experiment with those, and then I'm going to have you at your table create the questions that move us to the other sacraments. So, for example, I offer you this. With respect to the sacrament of baptism and religious conversion, these are all questions now. From here on out, it's questions, and it's for you at your table. Baptism and religious conversion. What decisions have I made that are the contemporary equivalent of Bartimaeus getting up, casting off his cloak, and coming to Jesus? I'm really hoping you heard that this past weekend. Okay? The key on that, those marvelous dimensions, get up. In order to get up, he had to cast off his cloak, come to Jesus. Know that he really, more properly, I could have written that, know that Jesus is calling you. What decisions have I made that are the contemporary equivalent of me, like Bartimaeus, getting up, casting off the cloak, knowing that Jesus is calling me? Now, if I have to answer that, I have to say, and Susie will commiserate with me on this one, well, hold on, I made my entire career for 30 years, a career that worked within the church setting. I served the Diocese of Phoenix for 30 years. I devoted myself to, and I hope to continue devoting myself to, making sure that I get up every day, that I have the fortitude to say, okay, once again, into the breach. I think that was Shakespeare, but you get the idea. Into the breach, let's sally forth. Let's see if we can create the kind of world that God has in mind for the people of God. And what am I doing today to grow my own awareness that Jesus is calling me? So if I forget to pray on a regular basis, I have a tendency to forget that Jesus is calling me. So my answer to this question for myself, for my own examine of my conscience, is I make sure to pray every single day. And the days that I have not prayed, I really, really feel badly about it. There should be less of those days, right? I need to make sure that I am constantly, that I'm avoiding ever taking for granted my need to be close to Jesus. I think a liability of people who work within the church structure is that we can go on coast mode with that. We can run the risk of taking it for granted. It takes hard work sometimes to get right into the journey to be close to Jesus. Honestly, it's why I became a biblical scholar. That and the desire to tell stories. You know, but it really is. It's why I wanted that leaning in to get to know more and to know, wait, how did that work? And what made this person tick and that person tick in the narrative? And why did this evangelist write that narrative that way and not this way, the way one of the other evangelists wrote it? And why is that? And what's the background to the Christian community that listened to that? Because all of that helps me listen in a new way. Those are questions of religious conversion. And then what needs to be developed further in me to renew my discipleship in Christ? Now I'm asking you those questions. You don't need to talk with your neighbor, but you do need to pause for a moment and reflect on that, on the answer to either one or both of those questions. Question? Yeah? Aha.
But you're saying that that event is happening every day, as is penance, as is Eucharist,
yes,
as is holy orders, as is matrimony.
That's right. Give that man a medal. That's exactly it. I am saying, because what he's saying is, you're saying that, he said, I'm repeating just for those who are watching, he's saying, well, my baptism was something that happened long ago, and what you're saying is that I'm reliving that every single day, and I'm reliving matrimony every single day. Yes, we step into a life of baptism that commits us to living into that baptism every single day, taking it every single day as a new call to live into our baptism. Exactly, as a new call to live differently. So we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean that I was baptized? What does it mean that I yet again present myself as a disciple, as a follower of Christ on a daily basis? Now, what you just surfaced is actually, let's see, is it the next one? Yes, it is. Belongs in this department. It belongs exactly as a perfect question for intellectual conversion. It belongs as, oh goodness, what do I need to do to reframe my thinking about baptism instead of thinking of it as a thing long ago, as thinking of baptism as the celebration. Remember, a sacrament is a celebration. I like to always say a sacrament is a celebration of that which is. Okay, a matrimony, it's a celebration of the love that a couple has and the desire for that love to pour itself out as a manifestation of God's presence to the community. So if you're not married going up the aisle, you're not married coming down the aisle, many times they say, because you're celebrating that which already is. When we celebrate the sacraments in church, that's why we celebrate them in church. They're always for the good of the community. So baptism is for the good of the community. It's why today we baptize infants and adults in a communal large setting. Why? Because the community needs to see the witness of those who are yet again today recommitting themselves to life as a follower of Christ. And it's why whenever you're in the context of a baptism, the priest will always turn and invite all of us to renew our baptismal vows, right? Every single Sunday that we have babies baptized in church, or every single Easter vigil, we make them over and over and over and over again. That your observation is very astute and quite difficult for us to contemplate. I'm going back to the religious conversion for a moment. Yeah. So for me to continue to renew my discipleship in Christ, what needs to be developed further in me? Another question or comment?
So then that leads to the question of the sacraments that are done repeatedly. Penance, Eucharist. Why? I mean, if you relive in baptism every day, can't you relive Eucharist every day?
You absolutely can, and we do. Yes, yeah. Keep seeing if we develop these questions and these responses, this conversation as we go forward. Okay, because I think we might hit it. And we can always come back to it towards the end, and maybe we might be able to get a mic where we could hear the questions and the comments. So that's religious conversion. Let me put them into the context of each other, though. So here's the intellectual conversion. What could shift in me with relation to my understanding of baptism as we see it in the Gospels? Remember what we see in the Gospels is baptism Jesus is baptized, and he is propelled out immediately to serve. To serve. He is propelled out to serve and to become a healing, transformative presence that is, if you like, the presence of God's power acting in the community. And that happens immediately upon his baptism. Except on his way to doing that, remember what happens in all the Gospels? He has that quick sojourn in the desert, where the people who are listening in the first century say, oh, he too had his journey in the desert. He too had his moment of wondering about his own worth and feeling tempted and having to grapple with hunger and grapple with the temptations that tempt all human persons. And in light form or in a more lengthy form, all of the evangelists deal with that, and they acknowledge that he was first driven into the desert, he was first assailed by temptations, and then coming forth from that, much as the ancient Israelites came forth from the 40 years in the desert. And 40 is always a number that really means pretty much almost eternity. It means just a long time. It's like in Ireland when we say the night is but a pup. It's the way that we say, it's early yet, don't leave the party yet. But we never say don't leave the party or it's early yet. We always say the night is but a pup. Everybody knows what we mean by it. See, it's just an expression, and you have to translate it. In the New Testament and in the Old Testament, when you come across 40 years, just say to yourself, that doesn't mean 40 literally or 40 days. It doesn't mean 40 days literally. It means a super long and definitely way too long time. That's what it means. Okay. And so, as we understand baptism as that which propelled Jesus into becoming this extraordinary self-sacrificing healer and transformative presence in the world, what could shift in me with relation to my understanding of baptism that way? Equally well, what could shift in me in relation to my discomfort around the fact that baptism is something I get to live and relive every single day? When we cross ourselves, the whole purpose of the sign of the cross, and I grew up in a household that had those little, what was the word for them? Holy water font, yes, little tiny, every room. We were forever, it was a rather large, creaky old house too. We were constantly baptizing ourselves. God, I was wet all day. You know, just because you wouldn't dream of walking into a room without crossing yourself, the sign of the cross with the holy water, you know. There was, I sometimes suspect my mother of casting a little blessing upon the waters herself, but she always denied it, and she said it was always Father who did it. But that idea, what a beautiful tactile reminder of this acknowledgement and appropriation yet again of our baptism. That's what the sign of the cross does for us. Another question that we would ask, so that we're sure that we're attending to our intellectual conversion, we would ask, where's an area of growth for me in understanding baptism outside of the realm of original sin? That's a pet peeve of mine. We're fine with understanding baptism as that which, you know, dismisses, obliterates original sin. But you know, original baptism in the first century was for sin, for adult sin. It wasn't until St. Augustine that we developed the concept of original sin. I think I mentioned that in one of our previous weeks together. So baptism as that which releases an innocent child from the inheritance of original sin, that's one thing. But baptism that calls me to yet again renounce Satan, renounce sin on a regular basis, how often do I stop and think about the ramifications of that, and how would I have to grow in order to understand baptism as the renunciation of larger sin, not just personal sin, but sociological and socio-political sin? And that's a big question. What questions should I ask myself to stretch my knowledge of baptism's meaning? Its meaning both now and its meaning back and during the time of the early church. So you're all sitting very quietly and comfortably. I'm going to go through these baptism conversion questions, and then I'm going to ask you to seriously just talk at your table about having to think about baptism from all of these categories. Baptism and affective conversion. Where have I noticed myself attempt to put on Christ? Are you familiar with that marvelous phrase in St. Paul's a letter to put on Christ? Where have I noticed myself trying to put on Christ in the past? Was I successful? Did I do it poorly? Do I need a new focus? Yeah.
But you use the term affective conversion, and I don't understand.
Yeah, affective conversion is the conversion that we take on when we commit ourselves to being whole and well, full. And we throw off what I like to call the underside, our habits that betray the underside of ourselves. I believe when I mentioned that last time, I mentioned the fact that as a young adult, I was a people pleaser, chronic people pleaser. It was very hard to nail me down because anything I thought you wanted me to say, that was what I would say, that's what I would do. It took a long time before I was able to feel my own worth enough that I could stand in my own body, so to speak, and not be hard to be around for being such a people pleaser. Equally well, demons that one has, such as people whom I know and love, who would fondly say of each other, well, gosh, he's a bit of a control freak, you know. There are lots of family members of other friends of mine of whom others will say, oh, yeah, real control freak. Yeah, people who have control freakedness. People who are stuck in addictions, whether they're work addictions or pornography addictions, or whether they're alcohol or drug addictions, any kind of addictive behaviors where the tail is wagging the dog in terms of the addiction. So affective behavior has to do with attending to my wellness as a whole person, in my emotional and in basically, I like to think of it in terms of in my emotional well-being, but also in terms of the habits and behaviors that I take on, that I permit myself to do. What other kinds of difficulties in affective conversions do we see? If we present ourselves to others in a way that is not truly, doesn't really have the integrity of who we really are, that could be something that one would need to be healed from. If we have compulsions around gambling, of course, that would be another thing. If we have a tendency to be regularly and consistently dishonest, or if we have a tendency to be regularly and consistently not fulfilling of our word or our promises.
Well, that's what I was wondering about, is knowing what's right, or knowing how to do well, and then not doing well.
Yes, knowing what's right, knowing what to do that's well, making excuses. Yes, living life out of making justifications. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I remember years ago in a 12-step process, a lady said, now we're going to all conduct a searching and fearless moral inventory. And I took up my pen, and I was all ready. It was this kind of course I was part of. And then she said, oh, and by the way, no justifications allowed. And I dropped my pen, and I said, what do you mean no justifications allowed? And she said, well, if you blew up in anger, for example, people who are chronically hostile or have never developed a good and wholesome way to express anger or frustration, that would be a need for affective conversion. And I was, at the time, I was swimming in resentment and for all sorts of things with relation to this particular person in my life. And so I was nasty. I was not kind. I was beginning to become aggressive with that person. I was occasionally using language that was a little on the salty side, shall we say. I was becoming mean-spirited, and I was becoming a person that if I was looking at myself from the outside, I did not like. And I was happy in that until that very night when she said, by the way, no justifications allowed. And I said, well, explain that. And she said, well, you have to evaluate for yourself, according to your conscience, the extent to which a particular set of actions and behaviors are congruent with what you consider to be morally right. And I had to say to myself, so is yelling and huffing and puffing morally right? No. No justifications allowed. Darn. You see, so that actually on a dime, my life changed that particular evening, because I never again had the satisfaction of being able to dismiss my accountability for my behaviors by justifying it. So when you add no justifications allowed, then you really are faced with, yeah, but wait a minute, what are my moral values here? And you have to ask yourself, what are my moral values? And then you have to decide whether you're going to live into them. And that's excruciating, and that's affective conversion. Okay, it blends into a certain extent with moral conversion, but that desire to be a person of wellness. I had to learn how to speak in conflict situations because I was not, that people pleaser part of me had bred something else in me. So I had to decide to learn how to speak in difficult situations so that I would not massacre the person I was having a conflict with, but so that I would honor them and yet honor my desire to be a full presence within the context of the difficulties between us. That's a skill set, and I had to take it on and learn it and stay on it so that I would learn how to be a person that was peaceful and serene in the way that I desired to be. It's very personal work, this affective conversion stuff. How well have I, going back to this, how well have I allowed myself to identify honestly and heal from and maintain accountability for my compulsions, control needs, people pleaser, addictive, or other behaviors? How, this one's hard, how willing am I to have others nudge me towards healing of my areas that lack wellness? In other words, how willing am I to turn to others and say, if I should appear weak on this, would you be brave and just wave a hand at me or pat me on the back and say a word or two that would remind me that I'm trying to hold myself accountable to such and such a behavior, not such and such a behavior. This is the activity of reflecting in such a way that you commit yourself to affective conversion. Why? In this case, for baptism, is so that you can offer yourself as the vessel for Christ, so that you can be the perfect vessel, so to speak. We're never going to get perfect. Christ perfects us, but we aim for it. Moral conversion, political, or no, personal, right? Personal is here. How have I or have I not developed an ethical framework for the decisions that I make? Whether financial, work-related, business-related, or otherwise. Sometimes you come across people whose lives are kind of compartmentalized. They have certain behaviors here, but other behaviors that are differently over here in their business situations. How can I develop a custom of examining and questioning my assumptions about the rightness and wrongness of decisions? Not how can I make sure that I continue to be dead right about my assumptions and dead wrong about, or view other people's assumptions as dead wrong. But how can I continue to question my assumptions, examine them for the rightness or the wrongness of those assumptions and the decisions that I make? And how much do I commit to regularly engaging in the good old Jesuitical examine of conscience? How much do I call myself into exercises like that? And the last one of these is, for baptism, is baptism and moral conversion socio-political. How familiar am I with the baptismal call to care for the weakest and the most vulnerable in society? As I told you, I was at least 30-something before I even understood that my baptism had anything to do with matters of social justice. What concrete actions do I partake in that actually demonstrate my commitment to the common good? How much responsibility do I take for the way in which our society protects and empowers, or doesn't, the weakest and the most vulnerable? We cannot have a respect for the dignity of the human person without having a corresponding respect for the dignity of the human person, not just in the uterus, but all the way through to the very end of life. It is stunning to me that so many Catholics are completely in favor of the death penalty. There's no such thing as a disposable person. No matter how egregious the crime, that we find that person who has done that crime, and we find their personhood and acknowledge that their personhood is deeply loved by God, whose heart is breaking, of course, breaking. Even the people who committed these atrocities just this past week. God's heart breaks for what they have done, and at the same time loves them unconditionally, while absolutely abhorring the actions. I gotta tell you, I have a lot of spiritual homework to do when I contemplate that, because I am going to be ticked as all be darned if I get through the pearly gates of heaven and I see some of those folks lollygagging, walking their way around like they belong. I'm going to be ticked, because I'm going to go right up to God and say, what the heck are you thinking? How could you possibly? But that's my spiritual homework to do. That part of this I hate. But that's why I'm here, to make you equally miserable. Okay. Time is marching on. You have to have a break, and we're almost near the end of our time. So very quick break, and then back so that we can plow into this and we can ask ourselves, what would these questions look like for the other sacraments as well? So I have a question for you here. Would you like me to run through what I have on matrimony and the conversions and Eucharist and the conversions, or would you prefer to address these questions in small group at your table with relation to baptism? All right? Go through? I think some of the questions are good. And again, here's what I recommend. Yeah. What I recommend is that when they're up online, that you take the time to go through this session, take note of the questions, and develop a habit of every time you think about your way of living sacramentally, that you stop and you ask yourself, okay, what questions should I be asking myself here to make sure that my ongoing growth, my ongoing conversion is happening, and that you ask the questions around the 5 different dimensions. So, yes?
One quick question. Does this become too self-conscious?
It becomes so the question that Frank asks is, does this become too self-conscious? I think it becomes second nature. I think it becomes a habit that informs our living, ideally. It makes us uncomfortable, but the Gospels are designed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So it does make us uncomfortable, because it constantly calls us, it moves us into a place that our conversion is constant. It's not a one-time thing. And that was really at the heart of both Bernard Lonergan's and Donald Gelpie's theology, is conversion is not static. Conversion is ongoing, and it's a constant maturing of our thought frame. I always like to put it this way for students. They never like the question, but I say, what if we discovered intelligent life on another planet in 15 years? Intelligent life on another planet. And we get over our fear, and we suddenly learn that there's an entire other planet there. Just think of the questions that we have to ask around the Jesus event, around the action of God, around the plan of God, around the role of Jesus in the cosmos. Do you see what I mean? All of a sudden, the way in which we read our sacred texts have new dimensions to them. We have to reinterpret them in light of new awarenesses. Does that make sense? Everything becomes more complex. We have to be able to have our minds ready to tackle new questions at all time. That's why conversion is an ongoing process. We have a lot of work to do, because otherwise we won't be ready and we'll think it's static. So let's take a look at matrimony. Matrimony and religious conversion. How well do I live up to my vow that I will be the best possible presence of Jesus to my spouse? What do I need to do now to live into that vow more fully? Okay, I'm not married now, but I was once for about 37 years. And I remember waking up at year 12 and turning to Jim, who was still one of my best friends, and saying, "Oh my gosh, Jim, I just discovered yesterday that I am your best possible shot of you seeing the face of Jesus. You are so out of luck." I didn't even know. I'd been married for 12 years and I had not listened sufficiently to the prayers of the marriage rite, that I did not understand that I was committing to be the best possible presence of Jesus to him, so that together we could be the best possible presence of Christ's self-giving love to the entire world. Because remember, sacraments are communal. They're for the good of the community. So our life as a couple that was supposed to be filled with life and love and laughter, which it was indeed, was to be a witness, so that people, ideally, I love this kind of concept, when they see God face to face, they say, "I knew it. That was you all along in that thing Tricia and Jim had. I knew it." And that they recognize, when they see God face to face, that they recognize in that face-to-face encounter all of the witnesses, the experiences of God that they have had at little droplet moments over the course of time. So, Margie, Frank, that's it. How well are you looking at each other saying best possible experience of the face of Christ today, you know? Yeah. It's hard though, isn't it? Oh my goodness, you want to talk about that messing with your life? That's going to mess with your life. That's hard work, you know? How well do I do as an intentional witness to the self-giving love of God in Christ that the community needs to experience? I'm great when I'm in a good mood. I'm just not so great when I'm tired and cranky. And I'm not sure that I'm the best possible witness. We use that word witness all the time. Witness to Christ's self-giving love as manifesting the love of God. Again, we point to Christ, Christ points to God. Right? It's a heavy load. They gave us a huge job description. Matrimony and intellectual conversion asks, how alert am I to a deep understanding of a sacramental marriage? How conscious am I of the ramifications of a promise to serve as a witness to the world of Christ's sacrificial love? How much do I continue to ask the deeper questions about what matrimonial love is? And how much do I seek learning in this respect? Affective conversion. How healthy and whole are my interactions with my spouse? From the point of view of communication habits, kind and compassionate listening, presence, real presence, avoidance of my own self-absorption, etc., etc. Good grief, you're never going to have just a floating moment if you take all of these questions to you will become very fraught with anxiety about whether or not you're living into this or you're living into that. It does, but after a while it becomes fairly intentional. How well have I healed, and do I continue to heal my areas of brokenness, the chains, so to speak, that hold me bound, so that I grow in wellness and wholeness as a vessel for Christ's presence in our marriage? Moral conversion, personal. How do I understand fidelity in my marriage? Am I careful to observe fidelity not only in sexuality, but in emotional connectedness, in time allocation, physical activity and presence, doing things together, etc.? Oftentimes, sociologists will say that sexual infidelity is typically the last form of infidelity that a marriage experiences. That long before the sexual infidelity, the partner has begun to have emotional disconnectedness, emotional infidelity, sometimes intellectual infidelity, oftentimes time and space, spending more time with friends, friends or colleagues at work and so on, rather than making the time to be present and faithful to the relationship, not just the sexuality dimension of it. And so all of those have to do with that kind of understanding around our morality. How careful am I to remain attentive to the healing, supportive, self-giving presence that my spouse needs me to be? The good old 5 love languages made a good stab at that, trying to help people understand how to be responsive to the needs that each of the partner in a marriage had. Sociopolitical. In what ways do I seek ways for my compassion to the world to be a hallmark of my marriage? And I want to give you the Jack Jezreel example here. Jack Jezreel is the author of this book, A New Way to Be Church, Parish Renewal from the Outside In. I recommend it unhesitatingly to be bought by millions of people. Millions. A New Way to Be Church, Parish Renewal from the Outside In. It's phenomenal. It suggests a different way for parishes to operate. What he does in here is he has one chapter where he talks about his marriage. And he says, Maggie and I, his wife Maggie, courted and married with a shared assumption that we would spend the rest of our lives together, working to address the needs of impoverished people, living simply, acting non-violently, etc., etc., etc. We tried to live simply. It was great. It was a beautiful way to begin. They met at the Catholic Worker House in Kentucky. So here's where he describes an episode in their life. He says, I have a memory of when Maggie and I were living on a farm. Money was always tight. When our youngest child was old enough to attend school, Maggie decided she would go back to work to help with finances. As someone who had always dabbled in art, she was planning to apply for a part-time art teacher position that had opened up at a local school in rural Kentucky where we were then living. She was excited about it because she loved art and thought she would enjoy teaching art to kids, and so she went off to interview at the school. When she got back home, I asked her how it went. She told me that she got a job, but the way she said it made me curious. Did you get the art teacher job? I asked. Well, yes, she said, but I decided not to take it. And then I listened as she shared what had happened. The school had need for someone to work one-on-one with a little boy who had a rare and devastating disease called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome that results in a neurological condition that interrupts motor skills and strangely triggers children to hurt themselves. The condition looks like cerebral palsy because the children are confined to wheelchairs, have their heads harnessed so they can't bang them against walls or hard objects, and wear mouthpieces so that they don't chew on their tongues or lips. It is a cruel disease. Most die by the time they're 15 due to organ failure. Maggie said simply, nobody applied, so I figured I could do it. And my heart swelled with awe and wonder and the greatest admiration and love. It is hard to fall out of love with a person like that. What Jack Jezreel had pointed out earlier in this chapter is that for all that when you marry, you swear to be in love with each other and to love each other for your entire life. What actually happens is, most married people know that after a while, there's less passion and things change a little bit. And what he says is that her commitment to living as a person of compassion was what continued to cause their marriage to have new meaning over and over and over again. And so I talked to Maggie when I read this, because they had asked me to review this book, and I called her right away and I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is so romantic. It's the most beautiful story of a marriage I've ever seen, you know. And she said, well, I said, is it right on? And she said, believe it or not, it's right on, yeah. Their commitment to becoming a couple that is bound together by the compassion that they bring to the world, that's now what keeps their marriage alive. I thought it was marvelous. He admires her for this extraordinary heart that she has. She admires him for the marvelous eloquence that he has, a commitment to the Just Faith program, which is a marvelous program of renewal that parishes can take on. And together, they feed each other's love simply by becoming this presence of compassion to the world. I just thought it was beautiful. And so we ask ourselves in terms of conversion socio-political, you know, in what ways do I seek from my compassion to the world to be a hallmark, the hallmark of my marriage? And then how is my family a training ground for hospitality and service to the world? The Catholic bishops wrote a piece that urged people to understand, it was a document that urged people to understand that the vision for families is that they become a community of life and learning, a training ground for hospitality and service to the world. How is my household a model of solidarity, compassion, and care for creation? I meet young couples who don't have any idea that this is a vision that could actually form and frame the household and the family that they build. That's what conversion sociopolitical brings to thinking about marriage. Do you see how we ask those questions? Framed, and there are other questions for Eucharist. We're running out of time, but there you'll be able to see, if you go back on the website that Susie mentioned, you'll be able to see again the questions that we derive for ourselves around Eucharist and what it is to become a people who are committed to being bread for the world. And so my suggestion for you is that you take these examples, and they're not difficult questions to formulate, and you formulate them in the context of what is it to be somebody committed to healing within within the context of the sacrament of the sick. What is it? What do I need? What questions do we need to ask ourselves around affective conversion, about the way in which we allow the illness of others to affect us, for example. When we look at the sacrament of ordination, what questions do we ask ourselves around the 5 conversion processes, around what it is to be ordained to service for the world? Just because we are not ordained doesn't mean that we can't ask these questions around the 5 different kinds of conversions of each of the sacraments, and then allow that to move us forward towards living sacramentally in the world. I'm going to skip past the Eucharist slides so that I can bring us to the close with just these observations here. We're invited to commit ourselves to a transformational process that is lifelong. We're invited to be attentive to what we're truly experiencing. And by that I mean, let's be sure that the narrative that we run in our heads is actually a narrative that clearly looks at the experience that we're living. Sometimes there can be a disconnect between the narrative, what I like to call the pretty story that we tell in our heads, as opposed to the real actual experience of our lives. And what are we attending to? What are we missing? And are we willing to develop a narrative and continue to grow that narrative, always as the narrative of how we are embodying Jesus in the world? And then, typically, it's important to place prayer at the center. I believe that oftentimes when we speak of prayer, we sometimes will place it at the forefront, and we'll say, I will make sure that I pray for this. I pray for you. We say to people, I will pray for you, or I will pray for this intention. The only problem there is that sometimes the prayer satisfies us so much that there's no follow-up experience needed. And so I would say place prayer at the very center of your lives, so that every day your prayer is, as I hope mine is learning to be, we're all in the process of developing ourselves into people who asking the guidance of God in Christ, that we commit ourselves to the journey. It's the journey of the transformative presence of that's needed in the world. I'll close with the dream, and I believe I mentioned this at the early stages of our time together, the dream of Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin was a marvelous theologian who had this idea that the presence of Christ, the Spirit of Christ in the world, is cumulative. And so according as I commit myself to living sacramentally, that is, to living with the fullness of the presence of Christ as much as I can, and according as you do and you do and you do and you all do, that presence accumulates in the world. And then it spreads itself out throughout the United States, and it spreads itself across the entire world. And then it doesn't go away when we die. It stays. And then the next generation who have been formed in the training ground of hospitality and service to the world, they take on the presence of Christ, and they live it. And he said, according as the generations go by, the presence of Christ fills up the world, so much so that finally, eventually, the world is nothing but the fullness of the Spirit of Christ, and finally, the thin membrane that separates heaven from earth is ruptured, and heaven comes about on earth. Now, I know diddly squat about the geographics of that, but I love the vision. That's Teilhard de Chardin, Teilhard DeChardin. Yeah, I'll come to you. Yeah, marvelous, marvelous vision for the world. So I offer you that with humility and with a sense of humor, because by golly, it's tough work, and it ruins your complacency, but it fills you with joy. And as long as you're not too dedicated to your own image of yourself, and you cut yourself some slack sometimes, the living into it, and sometimes the failing of it, and the trying again, is just a beautiful way of entering into this thing that we call living sacramentally. So I thank you for being here. I apologize that there's a lot to pack into the last session. Wish you well, and hope to see you all when we come back for wisdom, literature, and Psalms in the spring. Thank you all.